enforcement mechanisms, and timelines. Yep, we now have an agenda. Maybe call it concepts of a plan. But what we still lack is execution. That is the basic summary of what happened at Monday's summit featuring Trump, Zelensky, and a platoon of European leaders. As a result, it feels like something happened this time, rather than the dog and pony show from Friday. However, there is still a long way to go before any of this comes to an end, especially as a trilateral summit involving Russia is in the works. Let's walk through what actually went down. The current saga began on Friday, when Trump welcomed Putin to Alaska for a major summit on next steps in Ukraine. It ended up being more of a dummit than a summit, though. Not much happened, and not much could happen without Zelensky there, given that Ukraine can veto anything by simply continuing to fight. To the contrary, you would have to have something closer to what Monday's summit looked like, except add Putin to the mix. And with apologies, I must interrupt this video with a video within a video. But don't worry, this will tie into Europe's strategy for Monday. There has been an influx of online commentary that it was not the real Putin who showed up in Alaska, but rather a body double. And look, I get that it is fun on some level to indulge in conspiracy theories, but there are better things we should be doing with our time right now. The basic argument of the fake Putin theory is that Putin is an empty vessel, incapable of showing emotion. But look at all the emotions he showed during the trip. The only way this could happen is if it's a fake. What gets me is that this argument is often made in the same breath as the commentator saying that Putin is a cunning geopolitical strategist when it comes to peace talks, and is enjoying making a mockery of the process. Moreover, Putin was not only laughing while at the summit, he was laughing at the summit itself and all of us watching. The problem is that this argument is not internally consistent. Putin likes to mock the West and this process, and here he is mocking the process. That is very on brand for him. But simultaneously, it cannot be him because he does not do that. Look, Putin's goal for the Alaska summit was to schmooze with Trump. Well, schmoozing accomplished. He did everything that every other world leader has tried to do over the last 7 months. Well, minus Zelensky that one time. And we saw what happened as a consequence of that. And now you can see how this is tying back to the summit for Monday. Everyone's goal is to appeal to Trump's ego, make him happy, genuflect as appropriate, and entice him to do what you want him to do. It is actually a pretty good deal, because that is a whole lot cheaper than making the political concessions necessary that would move policy under normal circumstances. If you want to see someone from the West that is very good at doing this, look no further than Mark Rutte. Allegedly, Europe was coaching Zelensky on the way to the summit on how to do this, and not repeat February 28th. But hold that thought until we return to our regularly scheduled video. Anyway, what is the faulty premise of the argument? It is that Putin is incapable of emoting. And if you are someone in this camp, I cannot fault you. There are a lot of other things that you have to do with your time that I can guarantee are better than watching endless tapes of Putin. Most of what you have seen before is probably along the lines of Putin announcing a special military operation or an attack on Moscow. He is stoic in those videos because stoicism is the appropriate demeanor in those settings. But watching endless video of Putin to gather B-roll is part of my job, and I can tell you that Putin is perfectly capable of emoting when he wants to. Here is some file video of Putin beginning nuclear cooperation with Turkey, held remotely because it was during the pandemic. Still, it is Putin's job to schmooze with Erdogan, and so he schmoozes with Erdogan. Now, I cannot tell you whether it was the real Putin or not in Alaska, but I can tell you that anyone who has presented the aforementioned evidence of a fake Putin has not spent enough time following what goes on in the Kremlin to make that assertion. So, again, I cannot fault people for entertaining the idea, but I can fault those who are in positions of responsibility, who irresponsibly share poorly informed conspiracy theories. Meanwhile, the real conspiracy is that you clicked on one video and are about to get another. So if you enjoyed this video within a video, then please do not like, share, or subscribe, because we are about to go back to the main video. Where was I? Right. Alaska came to an end. Trump got back on Air Force One and informed Ukraine and the rest of the European partners about what happened. That quickly led to the announcement of a second summit on Monday in Washington with Zelensky, and then the main European partners decided that it would also be worth the trip for them. Over in Russia, the powers that be held a debriefing, which was as devoid of content as the Alaska summit itself. Washington looked more promising, though. Now, you might be looking at this slide and thinking to yourself, is that a movie poster for an ensemble film in the style of Love Actually? Sadly, no. But it is the cast of characters who attended today's summit. Zelensky's presence is obvious. Then you have NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte and President of the European Commission Ursula von der Leyen, present there because this is a Europe-wide problem. Next up were the leaders of Europe's G7 countries, German Chancellor Friedrich Merz, UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer, French President Emmanuel Macron, and Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. The odd man out seems to be Finnish President Alexander Stubb, the sole member of NATO's eastern flank attending, with Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland absent. Stubb is a sensible inclusion because he is friendly with Trump and is good at golf. When I started my PhD program in 2010, I never thought I would say that sentence, but here we are. And if you are wondering why the rest of the eastern flank did not participate, it may help to look at a map. All four of them are scared that Russia could invade them in the not-so-distant future, and thus they do not want to dilute their own manpower by deploying forces as a part of a peacekeeping mission in Ukraine. Anyway, Stubb's presence connects to a leading narrative about why they accompanied Zelensky. They wanted to avoid a repeat of the February 28th Oval Office meltdown. And yeah, I am sure that had something to do with it. But it is worth remembering that Trump and Zelensky had a very normal meeting at the NATO summit in June. Rather, the more critical reason for their presence is that they will have to play a critical role in enforcing whatever settlement is reached. And if you want to have a seat at the table, well, you need to be physically present at the table. Regardless, the day began without them. Instead, it was a bilateral meeting between Zelensky and Trump, including this press conference in the Oval Office. It is notable mostly for what did not happen. Fun fact, the number of meltdowns is inversely proportional to the gold adornments. The first two words out of Zelensky at this press conference were, "Thank you," a throwback to the previous meeting, and he repeated that phrase 3 times over the first 10 seconds. In another callback to February, there were some mild jokes about the suit that Zelensky chose to wear, with the comedian-turned-president firing jokes right back. The Western coalition collectively let out a deep sigh of relief at this point, as the conversation headed toward witty banter, and not a thorough examination of how many cards everyone was holding. One notable difference between Monday and last Friday was that the press conference was an actual press conference, with questions from the media answered by the two. Now, those questions touched on a bunch of off-topic issue areas, like the National Guard in D.C. and the security of electoral ballots. And there were plenty of non-answers too, especially on whether the United States would or would not provide security guarantees. Then again, if you spend any time watching politicians take questions from the press, you would know that this is par for the course. The point is, there were some leading questions that could have sent the whole thing off the rails. This time, though, everything stayed on track. Separately, Europe's Elite Eight had lunch and mulled existential questions, like whether Zelensky's outfit did indeed constitute a suit, which was also what Polymarket was up to, because of course there were bets on whether Zelensky would wear a suit to the Oval Office this time. Just so we're clear, I made up that first part. The second part is real, though. Everyone then transitioned to the substantively more important segment of the summit, a 9-way forum to discuss the terms of a settlement. The short summary is that this was another moment of Western optimism. They basically went around the table discussing their commitments to Ukraine and why a lasting peace is important. The only problem here is that at some point, you have to get down to brass tacks, and there was no real depth to the conversation there. Or to use some terminology that may be more familiar to Americans, they do not have a plan so much as they have concepts of a plan. Because this is a video about the summit itself, I am going to keep this part brief. It probably deserves a full-length video, though, perhaps later this week, because it is so central to getting a settlement to work. In the aftermath of the Alaska summit, the Trump administration's target turned from getting a ceasefire to getting an end settlement, as in a final settlement. This disappointed Europe because a ceasefire would benefit Kyiv. It would give Ukrainian soldiers time to develop entrenchments. That would both help Ukraine in the event that the ceasefire fails, and give Ukraine better leverage at the bargaining table in case it works. Unfortunately, the deeper problem here is that Russia can always veto a ceasefire proposal by continuing to, fire. So as much as the change in the Trump administration's position may frustrate Europe, it always has been the case that Russia has to be coerced into a ceasefire, and the West overall has not done enough to do that so far. I am spreading the shortcoming all the way around here. Ukraine on the battlefield, Europe for not sanctioning Russia enough and not spending enough, the United States for also not spending enough and on leadership as well. And if we can move on to the next part of this, it is a similar story with enforcement. Suppose that you want to artificially end the conflict before Russia thinks that it has captured an amount of territory commensurate with what it could get through a military conclusion. Then you need a system that makes sure that Russia does not try this whole thing again. It is great that Europe understands that enforcement is a problem, but concepts of enforcement mechanisms are not enforcement mechanisms. The whole point here is that if you want a trilateral summit to succeed, all of these questions need to get resolved. Until they do resolve those questions, it is not clear how a trilateral summit will result in meaningful steps to end the war. And maybe they have gone further on those steps behind the scenes, so maybe a trilateral summit will prove fruitful. But if they have gone further, it is weird that they would talk so much about ceasefires and enforcement publicly, but be completely vague on the details. Meanwhile, I have concepts of what a good book looks like. These are 2 great examples. Check the video description for more information about them. And if you enjoyed today's video, then please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.